wrote, speaks, writes, and consults on the human dimensions of technology, specifically in the information security field. He writes for a number of magazines: Secure Business Quarterly, Forbes, Wired, Computer Underground Digest. He's been studying UFOs for over 25 years. I'd like to give you Richard Thieme.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you. Let me tell you what you're going to get. You're going to get the, okay, condensed talk. I do have to catch a 5 o'clock shuttle. So each section is going to be about 5 minutes instead of about 20 minutes. And I'm going to try to sum up what I would want to say that's most important about this. As you have heard, if you've been here for 2 days, this is an extraordinary and diverse subculture. And we are caught between a rock and a hard place. And I'm going to try to illuminate what those two hard places are if you take this subject seriously. And I think most of you, if you were here 14 hours yesterday and as many hours as we've been here today, do. We can be our own worst enemies, and we are also up against a number of the forces that have been illuminated for us in the course of these 2 days that make this an extraordinarily difficult phenomena to investigate. What I always try to do in any area, I work in information security in that I'm a contributing editor for Information Security magazine. I've keynoted hacker conventions for about 7 or 8 years. DEF CON will be my 7th year in Vegas coming up later this month. I started with 100 kids out of the desert, and it's now about 6,000 people. It overlaps with the security world, the intelligence world. 6 years ago, the kids, as I called them, began offering workshops for the intelligence community, NSA, CIA, DIA people, working in information security. And so I've migrated into giving speeches and writing for those venues as well. That does not mean, as one often hears in this venue, that because you connect with, talk to, or work with people from NSA or CIA, that therefore you know anything more about UFOs than you did before you connected with them, any more than to find out somebody worked in one of those venues means that they know everything on the inside, because of course they don't. What I've learned in the security business and the information security business, and it applies to the UFO world, is we need to cultivate what the Zen Buddhists call a beginner's mind. A beginner's mind is a mind that continually steps back from the patterns it imposes on events, phenomena, reality, imposes them in unconscious, unavoidable ways. It's called projection sometimes. We project the deeper contents of ourselves onto a phenomena. And so I'm going to talk about how that takes place a little bit, because before I went into the world of security and information technology, I was an Episcopal priest for 16 years. I worked in 4 parishes in 3 different cultures: Utah, Hawaii, and Wisconsin, each one of which required me to understand deeply and with some subtlety and finesse the way the people I served constructed reality, by which I mean how they framed things, how when something happened they would interpret it, how it meant what it meant for them. Before that, in my 20s, I taught English Lit at the University of Illinois in Chicago for 5 years and wrote fiction. So my background at Northwestern and the University of Chicago was in English literature, and what that taught me was how narrative works, how text works, how stories get translated into people's stories. And when I became a priest, that simply extended that experience, because in a way ministry is nothing about people's stories being integrated into a larger story which makes sense of their lives, gives meaning to their lives, and enables them to connect their otherwise insignificant trajectory to a larger cosmic trajectory, which has a great deal of significance. If you're beginning to hear overtones of some of what we've heard over the last 2 days, it is not accidental. Because we project those contents of our deep souls onto our narratives, onto phenomena, for 2 reasons primarily. One is to survive. The first impulse is to survive. The second is to make sense of what is going on. You can see it post-September 11th. The first impulse was run from the cloud, get out of the building, get out of the fire and smoke, survive. The second, which was really jarring, was to try to comprehend, make sense, integrate, make whole, an understanding of what it was that took place. That began immediately with people telling stories about what happened, and the rest of us, if we weren't there, listening or connecting with people who were there. First survival, then we make sense of what happened even when it doesn't make sense. Chris Stiles referred to it as reality transformation. He's absolutely right. In the presence of an anomaly, something confronting our belief system or construction of reality that doesn't fit, our structure of understanding immediately shifts or breaks down. I talked to a psychiatrist about this in relationship to a UFO case I was investigating, where someone was riding their horses along the trail from their ranch house in South Dakota, and a big self-luminous object came up over the ridge and was tracking, or so it seemed, she and her friend as they rode. The horses became very skittish. They calmed the horses. She actually said, I felt like they wanted our horses. Interestingly, anyone remember Skippy the horse? Okay, that was immediately afterward. She heard on the radio about the horse, so she connected those two in her mind, making sense of it. Maybe there was no connection whatsoever. But they turned the horses around, got them back to the house, and it was so interesting. Instead of going in to tell the other people what had just happened, they just kept trotting on past the house, the other direction. And when they came back the other way, her father was running out of the house because a cousin interimly had left, gone to his house 4 miles away, and along the way saw the same object and its pyrotechnics in the sky, and called back to her father when he got home, and he came running out of the house and said, why didn't you tell me? And what she reflected on was that once they got back toward the house, it was as if it had never happened, even though it was still happening. It just slipped out of their consciousness, out of the forefront of their minds, into some other place. A psychiatrist told me it sounds very much like a kind of dissociation, or hypnosis, in fact. I was meeting the psychiatrist in a restaurant, and she began to show me using a pencil that this was no joke, and she moved the pencil back and forth. The blood drained from my face. I felt it. She could see it. And I felt myself going into a trance. She said, I'm moving it, and she told me exactly how fast she was moving it because it creates a certain kind of pattern in the brain, neuro-linguistic programming. It's no joke. It's objective. It's scientific. And we are supposed to connect our endeavors with science. So in the face of an anomalous event, especially one that shocks our core beliefs to their very center, we do have dissociated states. We try to make sense of what doesn't fit and reintegrate it by telling a narrative. You have heard many of them in the last 2 days. Once we have a new belief system, whether it's a religious conversion, with which I worked intimately, both in my own life and in the lives of people I served, or whether it's conversion to a political system in which we become ardent libertarians or passionate socialists or whatever, or whether it's a commitment to an understanding of the quote-unquote abduction phenomena in a particular way, once we make a commitment to a belief system, it fuses with us. Our interpretation and the deep experience that caused it in the first place become very, very difficult to separate. And that's why beginner's mind is absolutely essential. How do you stand back from a pattern that has imposed itself, formed itself, and already structures your belief in order to evaluate seriously, deeply, with discernment, critically, scientifically, whether it really is this narrative or story or pattern that makes sense of the data? I use words like soul. Let's put it in the psychological realm rather than the religious realm. Carl Jung said that the soul, being us, our being, our very essence, is immaterial. You can't weigh it. It's not quantifiable. Therefore, you can only notice it by its effects. In other words, you know the soul is highly active, he said, when 3 things are taking place: secrecy, fascination, and high energy. Secrecy, fascination, and high energy. One of the talks I do routinely is for the investment world, money managers, pension fund managers, mutual fund people, and the like. It's called The Stock Market, UFOs, and Religious Experience. And the thesis is this: if you listen to what people say about money and the markets, you begin to notice that they are often not describing money or the markets or the economic data at all, which disappears further and further in the background. They're describing their own psychological reactions to it. If I had time, I'd read you all those quotes from Barron's and the Wall Street Journal that I used to show that automatically, unconsciously, we project onto money the contents of our souls. And so, in the realm of money, is there secrecy, fascination, and high energy? You know, take the most obnoxious dweeb who walks into a party that everybody ignores and doesn't want anything to do with, and then be told that he made $18 billion in Silicon Valley, and suddenly the energy goes up, he becomes very interesting, and you go over and want to find out his secrets. Suddenly he's on the cover of a magazine. It's no accident. Nothing has been added to him except the stimulus that invites the projection of the contents of our own souls onto money, which, if you think about it, and I won't go too far in that direction, just think about money. It's not there. There's no such thing as money. It's a blank screen onto which we project ourselves. It's why when I worked in the ministry in the church, you could always say where your heart is, there your treasure goes, because that's all there is. Where you spend your money is what you value and who you are, and it shows up in your checkbook, and make a pie chart, and there's a mirror into which you can stare. Stock market, religious experience, symbols in the religious world invite the same kind of projections, and UFO phenomena. Secrecy, fascination, and high energy. You want to get a room quiet. When I'm doing talks in the serious world, I just keynoted InfraGard for the FBI, a 3-state super conference. I've spoken for the senior lawyers at Treasury, for businesses, for hackers, for information people all over the country, and increasingly in Europe as well. You want to get it real quiet, you just tell a UFO story like this one. Basic, real basic, but it's where it started for me 25 years ago. I was a priest at St. Peter's Church in Clearfield, Utah, my first parish, an Episcopal priest in Utah. I'm always on the outside. It makes your creativity really kind of flourish. And so the senior warden of that parish, the principal lay officer, was from the base. He retired later as a full bird colonel. He was kind of career Air Force officer who had what we call the right stuff. He knew what he was talking about. He had qualities of leadership that took him into battle. Many men followed him. In Vietnam, he was heavily decorated. He was terrific. I really loved and admired his capacities as a leader and an Air Force officer. He didn't BS, and he never disclosed anything inappropriately from his world on the base only a mile away from the door of our church. And this was 1978. We're sitting in the church basement, and I was talking about Alan Hynek's UFO experience and Jacques Vallée. They'd both been at Northwestern when I had been there earlier. And I said, you know, Bob, from what I read, because all I know is what I read, text, narrative, how text means, from what I read, you guys and your fastest fighters chase these things and you can't catch them. Now, you're used to a guy who's cocky. He would walk into the basement of that church wearing his Stetson hat, his mirror shades, his stogie, his flak jacket, his jeans, and his cowboy boots, and just kind of plant himself, and people kind of gathered around him, the way energy does coalesce around a person with authority. He was that kind of cocky guy, but he didn't look cocky as he answered. And I'll never forget as he kind of turned away and he said, well, you're right. We chase the goddamn things and we can't catch them. Now, at that moment, if you're what I would call in this context a normie, that is, a normal person who does not come to MUFON and who lives their life out there, that's when it gets very, very quiet. Because something that they believe is impossible has just been told to them by me, who has established credibility on the basis of an Air Force officer who is highly credible, that a phenomena they doubted seriously, genuinely exists. I use it as examples of how the truth moves from the edges to the center. And when it gets to the center, it becomes the center of a new consensus reality. I like to say in the information security world over the last 10 years, the edge is the center. Because the new truth, the new reality was arriving at the edge so fast as it moved to the center, a new one replaced it faster and faster, and it moves from the edge to the center, and once it gets to the center, a funny thing happens. It's no longer true. It's no longer true. I'll give you an example of what I mean. Robert Galvin used to be the chair of General Motors, Motorola. He built that company into the extraordinary entity that it is, and he did it through breakthrough ideas that really shifted models of understanding. He did them through strange ideas meetings in which anything was entertainable, and then it was brainstormed and winnowed until it fit something that could be worked with. But no idea was outrageous and couldn't be included. And when he was asked which ideas made the major breakthrough for him and for Motorola over the 3 or 4 decades he had been there, he thought about it seriously, and then he said, you know, every idea that turned out to be a breakthrough idea began its life as a minority opinion. It was said by one person on the edge of the group. One person. It wasn't even heard. But if they said it again, people laughed. If they could hear it, they laughed. And if they kept saying it, they laughed, but now they laughed with derision, with contempt. Sooner or later, they start laughing with anger. And they really start attacking the person. Pretty soon, they'd bring in 20/20, 60 Minutes camera crew to undermine the whole reputation and person as deeply as they could. And finally, the idea arrived at the center. And how did you know it arrived at the center? Because now everybody said they agreed with it, and they had always agreed with it all along. And he said the corollary to that is true, too. He said, you know, every time someone suggested a course of action or a way of thinking, and everybody immediately agreed that it was the right one, it was always wrong. It was always wrong. So he was echoing, I think, what George Bernard Shaw said when he noted that all great truth begins as blasphemy. All great truth begins as blasphemy. Now, what is the relevance of that to the domain of UFOs? Just this. This is not the rock, maybe this is the hard place. The rock, I'll give a story or two. I have so little time. But the rock is what we're up against as we try to understand what's really happening. The hard place is ourselves. Because when I describe that progression from the edge to the center, it's saying that what's contrary, what's heretical, what's not orthodox on the edge, we are thinking that's us. But I'm talking about us. I'm saying that this subculture has orthodoxy and heresy. And I have heard experiences described, which I recognize from my own experience, as the deep, unconscious projection of the contents of our souls onto a story that helps us make sense of ourselves and our life in the cosmos, makes us significant. Think about it, is all I'm asking you to do. I'm presenting you with an idea that I want to have percolate. Think about it. We need to hear the voices at the edges instead of accepting the perspective of the orthodoxy as it speaks about the great religious truths of the UFO world, by which I mean the Roswell event and alien abduction. They have become narratives that are orthodoxy and are the central beliefs of a subculture that gathers around them and derives nurture, sustenance, coherence, and meaning from them. On the other hand, we're up against really tricky things that we can't easily deal with if we're trying to apply scientific methodology, as Rich referred to the other day, in terms of coming to terms with the intelligence community and the national security state. I'm going to give you a couple examples of just why that's so hard, okay? One is Gene Poteet. Gene Poteet used to be the go-to radar guy, one of the go-to radar guys in the CIA. He's currently the head of AFIO, the Association of Former Intelligence Officers. And Gene was there at the time of the Gulf of Tonkin. He was there because Lyndon Johnson got the report that destroyers had been fired on by a patrol boat in the Gulf of Tonkin. For those of you who are young, I'm referring to the Vietnam War. Vietnam War is one of the wars that came before the wars in the Mideast, but after the wars in Europe. For those of you who are young and did not major in history. But for some of us silverbacks, the Vietnam War was pretty formative and pretty significant. So we remember when we went to war in earnest, and it was the Gulf of Tonkin incident that created it. Patrol boats from North Vietnam fired on destroyers. Johnson got the word. He went to the head of the CIA, John McCone. He said, I need to know if these reports are accurate. McCone went to his go-to guy, Gene Poteet, and he said, what is it going to take for us to evaluate the reports from the destroyers? Poteet said it's going to take about 48 hours. He told me this. It's going to take about 48 hours because we need to get the ship's logs. We need to know the weather, the meteorological conditions in the Gulf. We need to know the conditions of the sea. There are a number of variables we must know, but if we know them, then I can definitely give you an accurate answer as to whether or not the patrol boats fired on the destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin. McCone went back to Johnson and told him that. Johnson said, I haven't got 48 hours. I want to know tomorrow morning. He said, I can tell you for sure in 48 hours. The next morning, Lyndon Johnson announced we had been fired on in the Gulf of Tonkin, began bombing North Vietnam, and the war was underway. Poteet went back to McCone and said, I don't understand. I guess he was young and naive. I don't understand. I could have told him whether it really happened or not. Intelligence could have served policy. Why didn't he wait? And McCone said, I would guess with a sigh, but I don't know, because he didn't want to know. He wanted to go to war. Never spoke to McCone again. McCone resigned a few months later as head of the CIA, because once you know that they know what you know and that you didn't use the intelligence that could have been provided, the conversation is over. Now, I bring in Jean Potit because he said this. He said, I was very clever. He said it wasn't really rocket science. It was just knowing how to put, and I won't go into the science of it because I'm not an engineer, but the description can be verified because he did it. 1960-61, he was a man who learned how to put false radar returns onto enemy radar. Why? Because we wanted to test the radar in the Soviet Union. And we wanted to know what it was capable of picking up and when. But we didn't want to lose planes to it. We didn't want to fly them in, test it, and get shot down in the process of gaining information. So Potit learned how to put blips on the radar of the enemy that would simulate altitude, any altitude, speed, any speed, and size, any size. So you could tell them the kind of plane you wanted to put on the radar, and they would put it on, and then they would watch for the Soviet response. One funny story he told was during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when they were doing this to the Cuban radar, and the Cubans scrambled MiGs to go after what they thought were intruding aircraft, and they overheard, the NSA being pretty clever at intercepting real-time conversations, they overheard the pilot calling to his base back in Cuba, I can see the plane. All right? When you believe something, you can see it. It's not the other way around. When you see something, you believe it. It's when you believe something, then you see it. He believed there was a plane, the radar returns were clear, therefore he saw the plane, he asked for permission to fire. Potit looked at the other guys in the room, they all had the same idea at the same time, do it. Cut the radar so the blip went off the screen and they thought they had shot down the plane. As soon as he got permission to fire, they cut the blip, and the Cubans believed the plane was down. They never found the wreckage, of course, because there never was a plane. So I said, because all of these kinds of conversations I have always have this other edge. They have ever since I talked to my friend Bob back in the church basement. So I said, did you ever do that with radar and UFOs, just for the fun of it? Did you ever put false bogeys on the radar system? He said, well, he chuckled. He said, you know, we talked about that a lot, how much fun we could have with the do line. But in the CIA, of course, he said, you operate within constraints, and the constraints and parameters, as you heard this morning about air traffic, we don't violate those. We thought of what we could do, but we didn't do it. So now you're left with a clear question. Is he telling me the truth or not? Did they only do it once because it was funny to do it once? Or did they do it a few times? Or was that put at the service of some ulterior design? As subsequently we know, in the 70s, stealth technology was tested against radar systems, our own, to see the reactions of our own people on the line, to see something there 1 minute and gone the next, so that it seemed as if it had accelerated. My God, it must have gone from 0 to 5,000 in a heartbeat, when in fact it was merely stealth technology being stealthily tested against our own defenses to determine the reaction. It gets worse than that. It gets worse than that. Let me tell you another story. You like these stories? Yeah. Good stories. Okay. Here's another story. I love this one because this couldn't have happened by design. One of my colleagues has a source. We write about this stuff. This is a guy who is committed to understanding the technology. He spent 4 nights standing in the desert outside Edwards Air Force Base, watching with night goggles and a camcorder what was coming over. He called it the arrow, the dripping arrow. It looked like it was dripping molten plasma. He took it to friends at JPL, and they said, yep, that's bifurcated plasma, all right. He said, it looked like a glowing, luminous arrow that flew over Edwards back to Area 51. No, it wasn't a UFO, except it wasn't identified. It was just one of the many technologies we test in that area. Just like other sources in the desert tell me they have been watching silent triangles in the sky for years outside of the test ranges. But, excuse me, I didn't mean to shout. So, meanwhile, this other writer who does these kinds of investigations had a source who called him up one day after there was a major power outage in the Pacific Northwest. And he'd read the story accounting for the power outage, and he said, this power outage didn't happen that way. It doesn't make sense. Do you remember anything in the East? I mean, just draw your own conclusions for this. It didn't happen that way. Now, because of what his world was like, this is what he said he thought happened. I believe the power outage was an intrusion by narco-terrorists or non-state actor or some other third world country showing us that they had the power to shut down the power grid at will by hacking the infrastructure and getting to it through the net. That's what I think happened. And he said if it happens again within the week, that will confirm my hypothesis. And damned if 3 days later it didn't happen again, the power went out all over the Pacific Northwest. So you have a hypothesis which is reasonable, plausible, and explains an unknown event. All right, so I'm finding myself at one of these conferences I attend. The same conference, I was sitting next to the Director of Signal Intelligence for the NRO, the National Reconnaissance Office. And I said, you know, nothing really happens in translunar space that you guys can't see, does it? And he said, no, come to think of it, it doesn't. Nope, everything that happens around the Earth, we watch. So I said, well, have I ever seen any? Those are interesting questions. No, we've never seen anything like that. All right, so you're left with, well, did he or didn't he? So at the same conference, I'm sitting next to a major whose job involved testing certain electromagnetic weapons which had powerful consequences. One he described was so powerful, he said the SecDef, the Secretary of Defense, had to give us the voice command to go ahead and throw the switch and test this thing. And the SCIF, those of you in the military know a SCIF, or in security, you know it's a secure area where when you go to work on something or to talk, you have to have clearances to go in that room. Well, this wasn't a room, it was a whole canyon in the southwest, and that was the SCIF for this enterprise. And they had to wait till all the satellites were no longer flying over, and they got the word from the SecDef, and they threw the switch. And he said, damned if the lights didn't go out all over the Pacific Northwest. And so 3 days later, just to be sure, we did it again, and damned if they didn't go out again. Now, he said if anybody happened to stumble upon the SCIF or the canyon, we had a number of cover stories prepared, because this is how it works. Depending on your level of clearance, a cover story was prepared that made sense to you and that would integrate with your understanding so successfully that it was plausible and gave them plausible deniability about the real thing that they were doing. And if you had a different level of clearance, you got a different cover story. So in fact, even if the source had been correctly fed a true plausible story, that is a plausible but not true story, about a narco-terrorist committing an act of demonstration of power, it wasn't accurate. Now, when we talk about applying science, all right, I've missed my shuttle. Where's the guy's somebody gonna drive me out there? Okay, I get a ride? Okay. Where was I? We're talking about scientific methodology and how it does or does not apply to the study of unidentifiable phenomena, which, if they are some of what we think they are anomalous and have characteristics we cannot define by reference to any third point of reference. Therefore, we can't really say what it is that's happening. In the absence of the truth, we make it up. When there's secrecy and there's fascination, we project the contents of our souls onto the phenomena. The phenomena is real, but we can't see what it is when we're projecting the narrative, the story, the deep mythic truths our souls believe about it onto the phenomena. It makes it very difficult. You have to use the scientific methodology. There's been a lot of jokes about scientists and how stupid they are. You know, my wife always says to me, she learned this in the ministry, we learned about projection. I would be raging at somebody about how arrogant they were, and she would say, I wonder why that bothers you so much. You know, because the simple truth is that the things that enrage us most are the traits in ourselves which we don't want to see and therefore project onto others and therefore attack in others when we see them. So I would like to invite the whole conference to use its whole experience to reflect on what it is that we do all the time. Debunkery, arrogance, ego, shoddy science, institutionalized ways of thinking that we can't get outside, lack of courage in thinking new thoughts. Everything we have accused everybody else of doing, we do inside. That's why it is such a source of ridicule. We talked about all the other ridiculers and how it's used against us, but I think I noticed that an awful lot of people did it by ridiculing other people. whether it was for debunkery or bad science, or just saying their name and letting that be a code word for general laughter to ripple through the audience because we share an orthodoxy about who's a saint and who is a sinner. That's not science, that's religion. That's sociology, that's psychology. And you want to apply scientific methodology, it begins by applying the social science methodologies to understanding ourselves, just the way the Hubble, when it first went up, it took pictures, but they were very skewed. But you knew how they were skewed, and once you corrected for the skew, you had a clear picture. In the same way, if we know how we are skewed, we can then correct for our excesses and blind spots and see more clearly the phenomena it is, as I indicated, so difficult to wrestle with and so hard to define. Scientific methodology means we're accountable to a way of proceeding, and we'll keep each other accountable. I've noticed in all organizations, whether with the church, the businesses I work with, government, you name it, when organizations are functional and effective, especially in times of rapid and radical change like ours, there are three things that are always present. I'll say them quickly because I'm talking quickly to get through this. Mutuality or cooperative style. Mutuality, feedback, accountability. Mutuality, feedback, accountability. By which I mean what? Let's apply it inside. Mutuality means that each UFO investigator is not a lone ranger or rangerette. That there is some shared understanding of what is the baseline from which we begin. Mark Rodiger at CUFOS says, ufology is not a science, it is a proto-science. Every investigator begins again at the beginning. There is no amassed shared database of information that we agree has been collected according to any sane procedure, nor is it mined through all the technologies that are available to mine and look for patterns using artificial intelligence to see things we can't see. So each person starts at the beginning, and there's no memory, there's no history, because we all begin again, and when we die, it dies. Maybe if Chris Stiles stumbles into your Jesuit guy's study and finds a box load of stuff, then there's a huge eruption of joy and happiness because you have some evidence, but it's still very hard to get to, even though he told you how to get to it. So one of the things about scientific methodology, yes, scientists are ego-driven, competitive. Read the double helix, and Crick wanted to kill his competitors. They all do. People do. But they have a methodology that requires sharing the fruits of their research and the results, and then sharing where they begin to build the new baseline for moving forward. They may make mistakes, but scientific methodology is not at fault. Feedback. Every system, because things are changing rapidly, needs feedback loops outside. We have to listen to the skeptics, the critics, the debunkers, because they have a lot to say that can be of value to us. And if you shut out anyone who's trying to critique how you're behaving or acting or thinking, then you're saying, I can only exist in a narcissistic bubble in which only I see myself. All I see is a reflection. People think they're having a conversation with you, but you're looking at a one-way mirror. They're looking at you, you're looking at yourself. So we do need to build feedback loops outside the community to bring in the critique from people who are well-versed, like the speech we had this morning, Jeffrey Sanya, who's a brilliant engineer, or the conversation about aviation. It's just a place to begin to know what new technologies are doing. The same guy who stays in the desert outside the Air Force Base says he's watched outside Edwards jets hit stall speed. They get very, very slow and then turn at a right angle to the trajectory they had just been following. And if you're doing that at 10,000 feet, he said it could look very much in the desert sun like a disk that is making a right-angled turn. And then when you say, we don't have a technology that can do that, all you show is that you haven't even gone through the museum at Edwards Air Force Base, where it shows you pictures of the jets doing that at stall speed and then reversing their course, seemingly on a dime. It turned on a dime. You can't even begin to evaluate anomalies until you know what are not anomalies. That requires scientific method. It requires feedback loops inside the system as well. In other words, talking to one another instead of the egoistical competitiveness where each one builds a territory, a turf, a guru island, disciples, what have you. There's got to be more to it than that, or else it will never become credible. And when that guy said to me in the church basement, we chase the damn things and we can't catch them, something happened to my life. It shifted from being narrative or text to me wanting to know. I've had so many conversations in the hall or over meals, the ones that count the most, where somebody shows their obsessiveness because they saw some damn thing that nothing explains or had an experience or encounter. I put myself as a priest in a position to listen to people. As a priest, I sometimes talk to other priests. I talked to Edgar Mitchell's priest. He remembers a conversation in the 70s in a hotel room with Edgar Mitchell, the Apollo 14 astronaut, and Alan Hynek. They were both off stage, and therefore they were talking just freely and honestly. And my fellow priest said, I'll never forget it. The conversation wasn't about, do UFOs exist? The conversation was exclusively about, are they extraterrestrial, extraplanetary vehicles that come through space, or are they extra-dimensional that somehow warp space-time in ways we can't easily get a hold of yet? That was what the conversation was about. And so I put myself in a position to listen to other people who will confess or confide to their priest things about which they are almost ashamed. Haven't we all had that experience? When I'm doing a speech for 1,000 people on something, technology, in a big auditorium, and I use UFOs as an example of an anomaly that shows them how hard it is to think of the unthinkable. But then you wait, and everybody is gone except the one person who says to you, you don't have to tell me, I had an experience once. And you say, what was that like? And here you have a credible person acting like they had been abused, almost as if they are ashamed to tell you of something because they couldn't have had it happen to them, yet they did. An employee of mine did that. We're walking out of the office and said, I saw a UFO. I said, you want to tell me about it? Well, I couldn't have seen it because they don't exist, but I did. It's wonderful to listen to her conversation as the mind, an image of our own minds, negotiates with reality that can't be real, to see how it tries to come to terms. It's a mirror of ourselves trying to come to terms with it. That's why I'm saying, do not too quickly or glibly impose a narrative without doing the homework. When you're listening to the reports of quote-unquote research, the credibility of the investigator is absolutely critical. Do due diligence. It's real basic. You want to hire somebody for a job, you background them. You check to see if their educational background, their work experience, their references check out. Are they who they say they are? Ask them who they are. What have they done? Check it out. It's called prudence, and it's called due diligence. And when they present the fruits of their research, parse it, as we used to say in the English literature world. When you get a whole paragraph of narration about alien abduction, what you do is you listen carefully for the seams, the holes, the connecting links. And then you examine each one to say, now who exactly said that, and where did it come from, and where is it documented, and how can I verify that? And if you can't do that, then you are left, as David Jacobs said so clearly, with a narrative elicited through hypnotherapy by amateurs. I used to have people call me all the time, not all the time, but they would call and say, I think I've been abducted. I want to see an abduction therapist. And I'd say, I would strongly suggest you see a therapist. Because a therapist who is agnostic about the phenomena, who is open and good and competent, and you learn to trust them, the contents of your fears or realities will emerge. You don't need to hypnotize somebody in order to do therapy with them. It may be a nice adjunct, but it's a subset of therapy, a very small subset. Therapy is effective in the hands of a competent, compassionate practitioner. And if someone has genuinely been abducted, that will reveal itself in the contents of the therapy. And if it doesn't, then you know how the way the human mind works in all of its complexity and deviousness, its collusiveness, might be at least one factor that needs to be examined. You need to see the instrument that does the seeing in order to understand what it is that it is seeing. And of course, follow the money. Follow the money. What is money? Money is money, but money is also secondary gain, psychological gain. The pleasure, the joy of being a guru, the pleasure and joy of being a teacher, the pleasure and joy of being a researcher. It takes someone who's insignificant and gives us significance. You know, just all I'm saying is think about it. It's no different than I learned as a priest. Why'd you want to be up there pretending you had a clue when you didn't? Because nobody has a clue. And the older you get about these spiritual matters, that's the part that becomes clearer and clearer. So, just as I worked inside in that privileged position with people to try to find out what was going on our planet, So did others. One of my colleagues, a friend from one of the intelligence agencies, used his position as a teacher near Washington to ask people in the military and intelligence establishment from time to time about incidents of which he had heard that he believed they were present at. And what he told me was real basic. Let me see if I want to find the quote because I want to quote him accurately. I'm just turning to the thing I wrote for this. So, not sure where it is. Well, what he said was this, I'll paraphrase it. He said, the evidence is overwhelming. The evidence is overwhelming. There has been, he said, a cultural intrusion into our civilization for many, many years. Period. This is on the basis of privileged conversations with people in position to know. Not classified. He's my friend. He's not a spy. I'm not an enemy agent. He doesn't reveal classified information, and nobody else does in the intelligence community that I know. That isn't what we talk about. It was something else that he was doing when he was investigating the subject because he wanted to know. And he also is a master at covert deception. A master. And he reminded me always to look for the 3 hallmarks of cover and deception practiced so sophisticatedly these days as perception management. Illusion, misdirection, and ridicule. Illusion, misdirection, and ridicule. Most effective in terms of covering something else up with something that it looks like. Look at space war for the metaphors we need to use. Papers 10 and 15 years old define what we are doing in space to keep our weapons platforms secure. Cloaking devices, holographic projection, simulated environments that people will believe are real, and multispectral camouflage. Now apply those categories of defense to the psychological world, the world of psychological operations and information, where deception is practiced so effectively. And you will find metaphors for that up against which we are. Much of what passes in the world of ufology for genuine sightings is very effectively executed cover and deception. But you can't get at the likelihood of that without studying cover and deception practices first, so that you can begin to recognize some signs of it. What are the signs of the real phenomena? Well, my same friend says, 50 years. We're not long past the nuts and bolts stuff from the 40s. For 50 years, we've had reports that persist from all over the world and agree in the small details. He said, what's funny in America is not funny everywhere. And what's funny here for 10 years isn't funny for 50. The phenomena is reported with small details in agreement from all over the world over a long period of time. Therefore, the pattern persists. And that pattern ought to be a clue to us of how to begin to separate what we deceive ourselves by creating from what we can't control. But it also requires, I'm going to conclude because I do have to get going, it also does require the spiritual battle. There were 3 tracks going here over these 2 days. One was the hardware track, one was the alien abduction track, and the other was the spirituality/religion track. There are 3 different domains of experience, and they require that we learn to talk about them with different vocabularies. I know what it's like to go through a conversion experience in which everything you believe is called into question, in which your psyche begins spontaneously to restructure itself and lead you through a time of fear and anxiety. The contents become manifest in a way that you swear is real because it is real. It's just that it's not coming from somewhere else. It's coming from the depths of your own being, projected archetypal symbols onto your experience. When I finished, I read the shamanic journeys and realized that spontaneously I had gone through them myself, detail by detail. When I read the abduction scenarios, so many of them are identical to that journey. You can't simply ignore the data if you're going to come to the truth. So to link this to our theme, how to make ufology a little more scientific, mutuality, feedback, and accountability. Do the homework. What technologies are current? If you don't know, find out. And if you don't know, have the wisdom to know you don't know, because the difference between knowing you don't know and not knowing you don't know but not knowing is huge. If you know what you don't know, you can begin to know what you know. Then you begin to see the patterns of your own mind as it manipulates the data. Then you begin to see the possibility for reconstructing the data. Then you have the beginner's mind from a point of view outside yourself. Then you can progress in this very, very, very difficult environment. It requires painstaking discipline, rigorous methodology, and above all, a commitment to the truth above personality or our preferences. Thank you very much for your attention.